How are you guys doing? Today is Monday, May 17th, 2021, out here in this quarantine. I'm James Sims, and for this episode of The Elite, I'm going to do an individual profile on Matt Ryan, the starting quarterback for the Atlanta Falcons, which I think many people kind of toss up in the air whether he's elite. I think what you get an understanding for the consistency that this man was able to display throughout his career, not to mention like what he was consistently doing was putting up excellent numbers year after year. This is a player that's won an MVP. He was one of the most impressive college football players that a lot of people have ever seen. And right now, he is now the head of what could possibly be the most stacked offensive. Well, he probably has the best set of offensive weapons in the NFL, and it's a matter of time to see what he actually does with it if his line can actually protect him this year. So if you're unfamiliar with Matt Ryan, he's about a 6'4" quarterback for the Falcons. He has an arm, he can always throw it deep, but his range is about medium range, short range accuracy. He's a very accurate quarterback. He's been able to use Julio Jones, Roddy White, Tony Gonzalez. He knows exactly how to use his options. He knows how to use his weapons in his offense, not to mention Devontae Freeman, Todd Gurley, all the running backs that he's had in the backfield. As since 2008, he's virtually been the only constant on the Atlanta Falcons team. So just for a little bit of background, he would eventually he would grow up in Philadelphia. And after, being one of the best high school prospects that Boston College had seen, he was recruited to play there in 2000, or when they were in the Big East, this was under Tom O'Brien, which he would have his very first season, his freshman season. In 2004, he would actually play 7 games in a season where Boston College would actually finish with a 9-3 record in the Big East Conference. They would go on to win the Continental Tire Bowl, and Matt Ryan would slowly gain he was the backup. He threw 71 passes, completed less than half of them for maybe 300 yards, threw 2 touchdowns and 3 picks. So he wasn't necessarily there yet. His sophomore year at Boston College in the ACC, he would play 10 games in a season where Boston College would actually finish with a 10-3 season. They finished with a 9-3 season again, as they went on to beat Boise State in the Computers Bowl. But this time, Matt Ryan he would get more reps. I'm not sure if he was a complete starter yet in 2005, so he started the season as a second-string quarterback, but he would complete about 62% of his passes, throwing for about 1,514 yards, 8 touchdowns, 5 picks. Not really on the national radar yet. In his third year at Boston College in 2006, he would play all 12 games, and this time he would actually start for a Boston College team that would finish second in the ACC with a 10-3 record, as they ended up being like Navy in the Car Care Bowl. So in the 3 years he's been there, they actually won a bowl game for all 3 of the years that he was there, and they all finished in the top rankings. Actually, this year they finished about 20th, and with Matt Ryan's first season as a starter, he would complete about 61% of his passes in those 12 games, throwing for 15 touchdowns and 10 picks. Nothing that's really outside of the ordinary that really caught people's eyes, but 2007 would be the year that it would all change for Matt Ryan. I guess after bringing a new approach to how he was coming into his game. He also launched his MattyIce.com website that year. Weird fact, that doesn't mean anything to anything, but that's still there. In the 14 games that he would play, or in 2007, he would start all 14 games in a season where Boston College would finish 11-3. They had I think they won the ACC, or at least they won the division. They finished second in the ACC under Jeff Jagodzinski. And they would go on to beat Michigan State in the 2007 Champs Sports Bowl as they finished as a top 10 team, roughly. Matt Ryan would end up completing 59% of his passes for 4,507 yards. He threw for 31 touchdowns along with 19 picks. He was kind of all over the place, but he was such an amazing talent. Even after that, he had 2 rushing touchdowns. But nah, man. In 2007, Matt Ryan was a completely different force. he was so good that despite throwing 19 interceptions, he was named to the first team All ACC. He was named the ACC Player of the Year. He was a first team All American. And of course, he was given like the Manning Award, the Johnny Unitas Golden Arm. After that 2007 season, he established himself as the best prospect in the 2008 draft. And the Atlanta Falcons were currently in a predicament because that was when Michael Vick was in jail. So they had to get a brand new franchise quarterback, and they just so happened to have the third worst record in the NFL the prior season. So then they would actually take Matt Ryan with the third overall pick in the 2008 NFL draft. And ever since then, he's been the starter for the Atlanta Falcons. And ever since 2008, except for 3 games in what has been let me see if I can get this count exactly correct. In a 13-game season, he's only missed 3 games ever since he's been drafted by the Atlanta Falcons. Like I've listed players that have missed more than that in one 16-game season. So just to get started with the model of consistency that is Matt Ryan, his rookie season would come in 2008, his age 23 season. He would start all 16 games in a season where the Atlanta Falcons would finish with an 11-5 record, winning 7 more games than they did the previous year. Of course, Matt Ryan that year would be named Offensive Rookie of the Year, and Mike Smith was actually named Coach of the Year. In the season, with this 11-5 record, he would complete 61% of his passes, throwing for 3,440 yards, 16 touchdowns, and 11 interceptions. And then I guess, not to mention on the ground, he had like a touchdown for himself too. I'll probably just stick with the passing because he wasn't doing a lot of rushing, because I mean, like, it matters, but it's, I mean, like, the relevance, I'll stick to just like the passing because he's mostly like a passing quarterback. So like I said, after his rookie season, in which he would throw for over 3,000 yards, the Falcons would make the playoffs, and then they would end up losing in the wild card to the Arizona Cardinals, the year that the Arizona Cardinals would lose to the Steelers in Super Bowl 43. But following his Rookie of the Year season, he would come back in 2009 in his age 24 season. He would miss 2 games. He would start 14 games in a season where the Atlanta Falcons would finish with a 9-7 record. Just like that season, he would have a little bit of a statistical down season because he was dealing with injury. He would complete 58% of his passes. That's the only season in his NFL career in which he didn't complete 60% of his passes. He threw for 2,900 yards, 22 touchdowns, 14 interceptions. While, like I said, the Falcons just happened to miss the playoffs, they still had a winning record. And then the next year, Matt Ryan would officially become a Pro Bowler for the first time. In 2010, his age 25 season, Matt Ryan would start all 16 games in a season where the Atlanta Falcons finished with a 13-3 record, which up until then was the best record that they'd had since 1998. So, of course, historic season for Atlanta. In that season, he would complete 62% of his passes, which is a career high at that point. He threw for 3,700 yards, which is another career high at that point. He threw for 28 touchdowns and 9 interceptions in the season, which of course was a season high in touchdowns and the first time he ever threw a single-digit amount of interceptions in his NFL career. And like I said, in that season, he would go on to be named a Pro Bowler for the very first time in his career. And once the Falcons made the playoffs, they would actually lose to the Packers by about 27 in a season where the Packers would go on to beat the Steelers in the Super Bowl, just to give a little bit more context. Like, these are the teams that the Falcons were losing to. They were a very good team. Following that season, the Falcons would come back in 2011 for Matt Ryan's age 26 season. He would start all 16 games, in a season where the Atlanta Falcons would finish with a 10-6 record, with the second best record in the NFC South. He would miss the Pro Bowl, but he would still complete 61% of his passes. This is the third season in his first 4 in which he completed 60% of his passes. Or I guess after his second season, he did it every year. So I guess I'll mention it. He would go on to throw for 4,177 yards, the first time he ever eclipsed 4,000 yards in his career. He threw for 29 touchdowns, which at that point was a career high. He threw for 12 interceptions as well. And once the Atlanta Falcons made the playoffs, they would end up losing in the wild card round to the Giants, the year that the year the New York Giants went to the Super Bowl and won it. So this is three of the last 4 years in which Matt Ryan had gone to the playoffs. They had lost to the team in the NFC that would go on to the Super Bowl. Following 2011, he would come back in 2012 for what would be probably one of his best statistical seasons, at least at that point to date. He would start all 16 games in a season where the Falcons finished with a 13-3 record, which was the same record that they had 2 years prior. In this season, Matt Ryan would complete 68.6% of his passes. This is the only year in his career in which he led the NFL in completion percentage, but he actually did it. He would throw for 32 touchdowns, which would be the most touchdowns he'd ever throw in his career, the first time he ever eclipsed the 30 touchdown mark. He threw for 14 interceptions, which was tied for his career high. And like I said, he threw for 4,719 yards on the season. I believe that up until then, that's the closest he got until 5,000. So at that point, that was a career high. And he would make the Pro Bowl for the second time in a 3-year span, proving that his first Pro Bowl wasn't necessarily a fluke, but that he actually was a growing quarterback who was adjusting to this league pretty well. Once they made the playoffs, they would beat the Seahawks barely by 2, but they would end up losing the NFC Championship to the 49ers, and the 49ers came back, and that's the year where the 49ers went on to beat the Ravens in the Super Bowl in the Harbaugh Bowl. Following those seasons in which the Falcons had made the playoffs in 4 of the last 5 seasons, they would hit a bit of a playoff cold spell. In 2013, Matt Ryan would end up starting all 16 games in a season where the Atlanta Falcons would finish with a 4-12 record. He would complete 67.4% of his passes for 4,515 yards. He threw for 26 touchdowns. He threw for 17 interceptions, which in his career, that's the most touchdowns he's ever, or the most interceptions that he's ever thrown in a season to date. In that season, he would not make the Pro Bowl. And the Falcons, of course, would completely miss the playoffs, as many people were, of course, starting to. I mean, like, at that point, a lot of the troubles were on the defense, but Matt Ryan did make a good amount of mistakes that season. I think a lot of his interceptions were off, like, batted balls, but it's a whole other thing. But following the season, Matt Ryan would come back for a Pro Bowl season in a year where the Falcons did not make the playoffs. In 2014, he would start all 16 games in a season where the Falcons finished 16-10. Matt Ryan would go on to complete 66% of his passes for 4,694 yards. This would be the second time in his career where he at least topped the 4,600-yard mark. He did all this while throwing 28 touchdowns. This is the 4th time in his career he threw that many touchdowns. He threw 14 interceptions, which is also the 4th time he's thrown that many interceptions. And they would miss the playoffs, but Matt Ryan would make his 3rd Pro Bowl. As a quarterback in a league with so many good quarterbacks and so few quarterbacks can get picked, I mean, it says a lot that he's made it more than 2 times in a career in a division with Cam Newton and Drew Brees. Like, those two are just in his division. Jumping out into 2015, the last year of the Falcons' dry spell, Matt Ryan would start all 16 games in a season where the Falcons would finish with an 8-8 record. Completely missed the playoffs, by the way. But they finished 2nd in the NFC South. In this season, Matt Ryan would complete 66.3% of his passes. Of course, this would be his 6th year in a row and 7 in the last 8, or 7 in his first 8 in which he's completed 60% of his passes. But also, this is his 4th season in a row in which he's completed at least 66% of his passes. He threw for 4,591 yards. This is the 4th straight season in which he's topped the 4,500-yard mark, throwing for 21 touchdowns and then 16 interceptions, the 2nd most interceptions he'd ever throw in a season. Well, this season he would not go on to make the Pro Bowl, but of course he was out here making Atlanta proud. And following the 2015 season, Matt Ryan would enter what would be so far his best season to date, his age 31 season in 2016. In this season, he would start all 16 games in a season where the Atlanta Falcons finished with an 11-5 record. They went on to win their division. In this season, Matt Ryan would go on to complete 69.9% of his passes, his career high to date. He threw for 4,944 yards, his career high to date, the closest he's ever gotten to 50, or to 5,000, I'm sorry. He threw for 38 touchdowns, a career high to date. Up until then, there was 6 more touchdowns than he had thrown in his second Pro Bowl season. He had done so, or he had a 7.1 touchdown percentage, which led football that year. So of course, great season. He had 7 interceptions. To date, that is tied for the least amount of interceptions he's ever given up in a season. All this while averaging 9.3 yards per attempt, leading the NFL. He had adjusted yards gained per attempt. He led the league in that with 10.1. He would have the yards gained per pass completion. He led the league in that with 13.3. He had a high quarterback. He had a 117.1 quarterback rating, which led the NFL. He had his QBR by ESPN's metric was 79.6, the highest in all of football. He led the league in net yards gained per attempt and adjusted net yards gained per attempt, as he would go on to be named an All-Star for the 4th time in what would be a 7-year span. He was named to the first team All-NFL, the first team All-Pro for the only time in his career, and he would be named the MVP of the 2016 NFL season. As he led what was probably the most potent offense ever, their defense was just kind of holding them back, and that would be the story for them in the playoffs, as they would go on to beat the Seahawks 36-20 in the divisional round. They smoked the Packers in the NFC Championship, but they would end up losing a 28-3 lead to the Patriots, and the Patriots would end up beating them in overtime. But that would still go down as Matt Ryan's MVP, Offensive Player of the Year season, and Dan Quinn's second season with the team. Following that year in which they completely lost their chance at the Super Bowl, where they got the closest they possibly could, Matt Ryan would come back for his age 32 season and start 16 games in a season where the Falcons finished with a 10-6 record. He would complete 64% of his passes, which is the lowest he had thrown since 2011, but that's still incredibly high, even if you look at quarterbacks today. That is the 6th season in a row he's completed at least 64% of his passes, 8 seasons in a row where he's completed at least 60, and 9 of the last 10 where he's completed at least 60, and going into 2017. He would go on to throw for 4,095 yards. This would go down as his 7th straight season where he threw for 4,000 yards. He threw for 20 touchdowns, which is yet another season, which would be his 9th season in a row. He threw at least 20 of them. He threw for 12 interceptions, another double-digit interception season. And once the Falcons made the playoffs, they would end up beating the Rams in the wild card round. But they lost in the divisional round to the Eagles, who in 2017 will go on to win the Super Bowl. And the Eagles only won 15-10. It was a pretty close game. So this is a common theme with the Falcons getting super close or just running into the team that would be the eventual champions. Following that, the Falcons have not made the playoffs since 2017. So going into 2018, into Matt Ryan's age 33 season, he would start all 16 games in a season where the Falcons finished with a 7-9 record. He completed 69.4% of his passes, which at that point was the second highest completion percentage he's ever put up in a season. He threw for 4,924 yards, which is the second time he's eclipsed the 4,900 mark. He passed 20 less yards than he did his MVP season. And this was yet another 4,000-yard season, which up until then would be his 8th straight, I believe, at that point. He threw for 35 touchdowns. The third time in his career, he threw at least 30 touchdowns, the second most he's ever thrown in his career. This will be the second time he only threw 7 interceptions in his career, second time to his MVP season. And nonetheless, he would put together an amazing season that almost replicated his first. He would not make the Pro Bowl because the Falcons had a losing record for some reason, even though Matt Ryan had a season of all seasons. But once again, they wouldn't make the playoffs either. and that would transition him into his age 34 season in Atlanta, where he would start 15 games in a season where the Falcons finished with a 7-9 record, and they lost one game. They lost the game in which he didn't play. He led the league in pass completions for the very first time in his career, as he completed 66% of his passes. This would go down as what would this be? This would be the seventh season in that 8-year span in which he had completed at least 66% of his passes, which is insane when you think about it. But then at the same time, this would go down as his 10th straight season in which he's completed 60% of his passes. He would throw for 4,466 passing yards, which would be yet another season in which he's thrown for. This would be his 9th season in which he has thrown for at least 4,000 yards straight, 9 seasons straight. He would throw for 26 touchdowns. He would throw for 14 interceptions. He had the longest pass of the season, a 93-yarder. He was also sacked the most in the NFL too. And I mean, it is also quite worth it is wild worth mentioning that he didn't miss a game and he still led the league in completions. Even though he didn't make an All-Star, or even though he didn't make a Pro Bowl, he was still one of the league's most potent passers, despite the fact that his offensive line was letting him get destroyed behind the line. And then following that would lead into his most recent season, the 2020 season, which of course was definitely affected by COVID, but not like the others. They had the same season beginning to end, but of course no fans. In the 16 games that he would start for the Atlanta Falcons in 2020. He would start all 16 of the games. The Falcons finished with a 4-12 record. That was so bad, they ended up getting the highest drafted tight end ever this most recent season. Matt Ryan would lead the league in completions and attempts. This would be the second year in a row he led the league in completions. First time he ever led the league in attempts. He would complete 65% of his passes while leading the league in attempts. This most recent season, which would go down as the 8th time in the last 9 years he has completed at least 65% of his passes, and the outlier being in which he threw 64.7, which is basically, if you round it up, as 65, but I guess technically it's not. He would throw for 4,581 yards. This would be the 10th straight season in which he's thrown for 4,000 yards. And what I would say 7 of them were seasons in which he has thrown for at least 4,500 yards, which is ridiculous. He threw for 26 touchdowns, the same as he did the year before, but he threw 3 less interceptions. It was really just the team wasn't as complete. The offensive line was kind of faltering. The defense had a lot of injuries. But regardless, the Falcons, following that season, would pick up the highest drafted tight end ever in NFL history, and now he's going to be added to Matt Ryan's arsenal, as his name is Kyle Pitts. They still have Calvin Ridley. They still have the Falcons' elite wide receiver Julio Jones. They still have Todd Gurley in the background. It seems as though their offensive linemen are continuing to grow with the game, so it looks and they also have one of the easiest strength of schedule games for this upcoming season because they just released the schedule. And I think as of right now, if you were to look at Matt Ryan entering his age 36th birthday, he's a player that, even though he's not making the Pro Bowls, he's still completing 65% of his passes, and you can at least count on him to throw at least for 4,500 yards in a season. He's a very consistent, reliable quarterback that I think shows through his consistency year in and year out what elite can really mean, like, over a long span of time. I mean, it's a matter of time before he may lead this team back into the playoffs. It very well could happen this year, but it'll be a very interesting year. And for this calendar year, I still have Matt Ryan listed as an elite quarterback. But with that said, I want to thank everyone for listening to all 23 minutes of this piece. I hope all is well. And once today's games and matchups are done, I will come back tomorrow with another episode of The Elite. Until then, once again, thanks. And I wish everyone well. I hope everyone the best, and peace out. I'll catch you tomorrow.